Ataque de Estados Unidos.
United States attack on Venezuela. US Marines yesterday seized a supertanker off the coast of Venezuela. The military operation, in open violation of international law, is nothing less than an act of war by Donald Trump's government against Venezuela. But above all, yesterday's attack on the tanker represents another step within the framework of the new US strategy for Latin America, according to which the United States can carry out economic, political, and military interventions in Latin American countries whenever and however it wants. Colombia appears to be the next target in sight.
Próximo objetivo en la mira. Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenas.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 286 of Demolishing Myths. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up, as well as through subscriptions, memberships, and our PayPal account. So much news, so many updates, so much analysis for today's broadcast, Demolishers. We'll start by focusing on the available information, and then we'll move on to a broader, more theoretical analysis of the meaning and implications of what happened yesterday. Just yesterday, right during our broadcast with Fernando Moragon, Trump was starting a press conference. While here, by the way, the wrong logo appeared. Now it's the correct one for our beloved channel. Yesterday, during our broadcast, Trump made truly surprising statements in a press conference that was also surprising, unexpected, but he's known for those sudden calls to journalists to make announcements out of nowhere. Well, yesterday there was another one, but suddenly, at the start of the conference, these were Trump's words.
Tension.
It's been an interesting day.
Well, thank you very much for being here.
It's been an interesting day.
Many developments from a news standpoint, as you probably already know. Just a few minutes ago, we seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela.
The largest ever seized so far.
Later, and you'll be talking about that later with some other people.
And as the hours go by, they'll be able to talk to more people about this situation and receive more information about it. That's how yesterday's press conference began. By the way, once again, we couldn't broadcast it live because we were on air with Fernando Moragon. And just minutes after that bombshell piece of news, in that press conference called Without Prior Notice, this statement, already subtitled in Spanish, referred to the fate of that seized oil tanker.
These were Trump's words yesterday. What about the oil on this ship? Well, we'll keep it, I guess. When is he leaving? When is he leaving? When you have to follow the tanker. You're a good screenwriter. Just follow the tank. Keep following. Take a helicopter. Follow the tank. But I guess we're going to keep the...
You're gonna keep the oil.
You're going to keep the oil. We're going to keep the money, I assume. Those were Trump's words last night in the United States. And shortly after, this statement, or rather, this post on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, from U.S. Attorney General Pamela Bondi. Today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and the United States Coast Guard, with support from the Department of War, executed a seizure warrant for an oil tanker used to transport sanctioned oil from Venezuela and Iran.
Sancionado desde Venezuela e Irán. Durante varios años, el petrolero ha estado sancionado por Estados Unidos.
For several years, the oil tanker has been sanctioned by the United States due to its involvement in an illicit oil transport network that supports foreign terrorist organizations. This seizure, carried out off the coast of Venezuela, was conducted safely. Our investigation, together with the Department of Homeland Security, seeks to prevent the continued transport of sanctioned oil. The post was accompanied by this video, the first images of what happened. Here is what was published by Pam Bondi, the U.S. Federal Attorney General.
Pam Bondi, la fiscal general federal de Estados Unidos. Ahí, bien clarito, el helicóptero.
There, very clearly, the Black Hawk helicopter with the descent of the U.S. Marines. Specifically, we were able to count 10 Marines in the video. According to U.S. authorities, as well as Venezuelan authorities, no acts of violence against the crew were reported. No deaths, no injuries. In any case, the seizure, in quotes, was carried out by the force, as documented in this video. Once again, 10 U.S. Marines took part, in collaboration with the U.S. Coast Guard and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, more commonly known as the FBI. Here again, the images released by Pam Bondi. The Americans did not publicly reveal the exact location of, well, that's as far as it goes. Alright, they did not publicly reveal the exact location of this operation, nor the name of the seized oil tanker or supertanker. In some countries, oil tankers are called tanqueros. Even in countries with an oil tradition in Latin America, especially in Venezuela, they generally don't call them oil ships, but rather tanqueros. It's the same thing. An oil tanker or a tanquero, basically the same. They did not specify the name of the ship or the exact location beyond this reference to the coast of Venezuela. But investigators were able to determine that the United States had carried out the seizure, the capture of the oil tanker known as Skipper. Skipper, sanctioned in 2022, at that time under the name of the oil tanker Odessa, its previous name, was sanctioned then for trading Iranian oil within this very particular framework of US foreign policy that unilaterally determines sanctions against whomever it wants. If the United States wants to impose sanctions on a country just because, that represents a violation of international law. The only sanctions valid under international law are those determined by the United Nations Security Council, in which, logically, Russia and China also participate, and they would obviously reject such sanctions. So, the United States, and often Europe as well, impose illegal sanctions against Iran, in this case North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, and many other countries, just because, by force.
Rusia y muchos otros países más, porque sí, por la fuerza. ¿Sí? Bueno, en 2022 establecieron estas.
Well, in 2022, they imposed this sanction against that oil tanker because it was effectively trading Iranian oil. And for them, that oil represents a source of funding for the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the elite corps of the Iranian armed forces, and for Hezbollah, a political military group in Lebanon with strong ties to Iran, characterized and categorized by the United States as a terrorist group. The fact that Iran trades its oil, that it carries out exports, necessarily implies for them the use of that oil to finance terrorism. They also determine who is a terrorist and who is not. So they establish sanctions, and in 2022, they imposed sanctions against this vessel, which at that time was called Odessa. Beyond all this vessel does not necessarily represent property of the Iranian state, or even of an Iranian company. In fact, it flies the flag of Guyana, visible in the images distributed by the White House. Although the president of Guyana publicly denied this, arguing that despite the flag, the vessel was not registered with Guyana's maritime authorities. But beyond that, it did display the Guyanese flag. Its operator, according to investigations, none of this published by the United States, is registered in Nigeria. And its owner is registered in the Marshall Islands, right? There is the so-called shadow fleet, in this case Iranian-Venezuelan, which rather than a shadow fleet, we should describe as a fleet sanctioned by the United States. In the case, for example, of the Russian shadow fleet, sanctions are imposed not only by the United States, but also by the European Union and the United Kingdom. But basically, these vessels carry out trade for countries sanctioned by the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, the Northern Powers, even though they do not necessarily represent property belonging to those countries. In fact, in most cases, companies become interested precisely in this activity because of the higher cost of their services, since Iran, Venezuela, and Russia can pay larger sums for the transport of their hydrocarbons due to the existing sanctions on more conventional, more well-known shipping companies.
Convencionales, más célebres, ellas abandonan el negocio, rechazan esto porque no quieren.
They leave the business. They reject it because they don't want trouble with these major countries through sanctions. Then other companies appear that in charge of trading these hydrocarbons also carry out tasks specifically aimed at circumventing the sanctions, such as blending, as they call it, or mixing different types of crude oil from different origins on the high seas to dissolve that banned oil.
Para generar la disolución de ese petróleo prohibido, ¿sí? Por ejemplo, un barco proveniente de Irán con petróleo o de.
For example, a ship coming from Iran with oil, or from Venezuela or Russia, meets on the high seas with a ship coming from Saudi Arabia which is not under sanctions, and they carry out the exchange and mixing of the oils to ultimately, in some way, legalize the entire oil shipment. A great business for these companies. Western media describe them as the shadow fleet, but that is solely a response to US sanctions. They conduct their activities within the framework of international law and the laws of their own countries.
Los propios países. Y precisamente, por cierto, este barco.
And precisely, by the way, this ship, sanctioned in 2022 as Odessa and now renamed Skipper, is another of the usual issues. The change of names, the change of flags to evade sanctions, the change of operators, of the operator's nationality, the change of owners in the Marshall Islands linked to the British, owners sometimes in the Cayman Islands, all places far removed from international law, tax havens above all else for the great powers. In this case, they are also used by other countries, aiming for anonymity and secrecy because of the sanctions imposed by those very countries, not because they want it that way. In fact, this entails a cost for those countries.
Para esos países. Bueno, y este barco había recorrido.
Well, this ship had traveled. Sometimes, by the way, these ships turn off their geolocator precisely to create this blending, this mix of sanctioned, prohibited oil with other unsanctioned, supposedly permitted oil. Sometimes they turn off the geolocator, carry out various maneuvers, but this particular ship, in recent times, had made stops in Iran, indeed in Iraq, but also in the United Arab Emirates, a US ally, also in Guyana, Venezuela, Cuba, and many other places still unknown, precisely because of this trick of turning off the GPS, the geolocator, from time to trade generally that prohibited oil. They sell it, among other places, also in Europe or in NATO countries interested in this oil. They turn off the geolocator, sell it in those ports, and then turn it back on again out at sea.
Y después lo reactivan nuevamente en alta mar. Por lo tanto, no generaría asombro que en los próximos.
Therefore, it wouldn't be surprising if, in the coming days, reports emerged about this ship docking or landing in European ports as well. They travel around the world, right? And not necessarily as property of Iran, Venezuela, or Russia, but of other companies. In fact, at the time of the sanctions in 2022, this ship appeared as the property of a company owned by a Ukrainian businessman. Yes, an interesting detail, by the way. Well, for now, there isn't much more than that. The Venezuelans reacted quickly with a statement describing, here's the statement, this action as an open violation of international law and maritime law. Once again, as I said at the beginning of this broadcast, a clear act of war without ambiguity. Venezuela responded with a lengthy statement, describing this as an act of international piracy.
Caracterizando esto como un acto de piratería internacional. En otra declaración lo presentaron como.
In another statement, they presented it as a serious international crime. Naturally, that as well. And even harsher than that. For example, Diosdado Cabello called the Americans responsible for this action murderers, thieves, and pirates. That's the information. We should also remember, as part of the background data, before starting the analysis, the most interesting part of this broadcast, that this caused an increase today in crude oil prices on international markets, a rise in the price of Brent crude, and according to many sources, although not yet confirmed by any major Western outlet, also a call from Putin to Maduro, from Russia to Venezuela.
¿Sí? Bien, esto lo sabido hasta ahora.
Well, this is what has been known so far, the information that has been released. Now, what does this mean? What analysis should we carry out? How should we interpret what happened? Well, I would start with the broadest view possible and then move to the more specific. This appears in the context of a shift in the United States strategy in the region, the US strategy for Latin America, and even for the entire American continent, including Canada and Greenland as well.
Incluida Canadá e incluida Groenlandia también. Un cambio en la estrategia al cual
a shift in strategy that we could categorize as a move toward the hardening of the United States hemispheric policy. We presented this even before Trump took office. It will begin with Trump. A hardening, a tougher policy toward Latin America, in the context of his confrontation with China and Russia. The United States, faced with the rise of new global powers, above all, the rise of China, but also the strength shown by Russia in Ukraine, will retreat or has retreated from the European stage, will begin a direct war or direct confrontation with China, and will seek to generate, or at least that is its goal, to create in the American hemisphere in its own backyard, as we Latin Americans are conceptualized, its stronghold, its zone of exclusivity, not merely of influence, but of exclusivity. And this will mark the beginning of a tougher policy toward Latin America.
América Latina. Y en este contexto presenciamos desde hace ya.
And in this context, for more than a month now, we have witnessed the deployment of 15,000 troops to the Caribbean, mainly stationed in Puerto Rico and on other islands near Venezuela and even Colombia. 15,000 troops as a US presence, 12 ships, including the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford, the largest in the United States, and a huge number of planes and helicopters, such as the one seen in the document published in the video, released by Attorney General Pam Bondi. And also, in that context, the attacks initiated by the United States against the narco boats appear, basically, boats found in the Caribbean Sea and destroyed for allegedly trafficking drugs to the United States. Something completely senseless. For various reasons, which we have already detailed before. First of all, Venezuela is not a country that massively exports drugs. The drugs, cocaine, above all, are produced in Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and other types of drugs in Mexico, but not in Venezuela.
México, sí, no en Venezuela. En segundo lugar, realizar.
Secondly, taking trips by speedboat or ship from Venezuela to the United States makes absolutely no sense because of the enormous number of kilometers, the great distance between the two countries. Even more so, in a speedboat like the ones shown in the videos released by the United States, they would have to be filled with fuel tanks just to cover the distance between the Venezuelan coast and the southern coast of the United States, in Florida. Therefore, they couldn't be loaded with cocaine or other illegal substances because they would need to be packed with jerry cans, or as they're called in some countries, gas cylinders and fuel tanks, simply to complete that long journey. It's total nonsense. So Venezuela is not a massive exporter of drugs, nor do the distances make such a route from one place to the other logical.
Ni las distancias generan sentido de un lugar al otro, y menos aún genera sentido.
And even less sense does Trump's supposed claim about fentanyl exports make. Fentanyl, once again, just like methamphetamines, isn't economically profitable if it's produced so far away, right? That's why the fentanyl-producing states in the United States, just like in the series Breaking Bad, producing methamphetamines, import the necessary chemicals for production within the US, or at most, very close to the border. That way, they create a cheap drug that they can actually sell themselves. And who produces the industrial chemicals used to make fentanyl? China. Not because they're specifically made for fentanyl production, but for a whole range of other purposes. And part of that, obviously, is bought by fentanyl producers in the United States for drug manufacturing. A very small part, of course.
Para la producción de drogas, una parte mínima, obviamente. Esas sustancias no las genera Venezuela.
Those substances are not produced by Venezuela, and even less so, the production of fentanyl in Venezuela. A total absurdity. If the US authorities themselves, the very agencies supposedly dedicated to fighting drug trafficking in the United States, such as the DEA and other federal agencies, officially reject the idea of Venezuela as a major drug producer, then obviously these attacks on narco boats are in reality, so far, only identified as fishing vessels. These 22 attacks, which resulted in the deaths of 80 people, the only ones identified so far, fishermen and fisherwomen, once again appear in the context of this policy of hardening toward the region. And in some way, they represent a message, right? To set limits for the United States, but also a message for all the countries in the region.
Un mensaje también para todos los países de la región. Cuidado, porque si no responden a nuestras órdenes imperiales.
Be careful, because if they don't respond to our imperial orders, then we will begin attacking their boats, or any other assets, or any other citizens of their countries. Let's also remember the completely illegal incident shown in one of the videos of an attack on a boat, its destruction. And after that, the same video documented that some of the crew members still seemed alive, surviving, floating with the help of the boat's remains on the sea. Some murderous scoundrel decided to eliminate them with a new attack, which, by the way, under international law, and even under US law, even if they had been drug traffickers, terrorists or combatants, which is highly unlikely, no country, no armed forces, under the law of war or international law, can attack a soldier, combatant, or person in a situation of distress.
En una situación de zozobra, una vez atacada una embarcación enemiga.
Once an enemy vessel has been attacked and destroyed, the survivors become victims of that event, and countries are obligated to provide assistance to those people in the water, fighting for their lives. They are certainly not allowed to finish them off and cause their deaths, as happened in this case. This first led to a boast from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War. Yes, they did this under my orders. Later, he had to retract that statement, because it constitutes the commission of a crime, a clear war crime, even under US law. And very likely, once Donald Trump's term is over, judicial investigations will begin, both international and national, over this matter. Then, Pete Hegseth first boasted, "Yes, that's right. I gave the order, or I would have given the order." Those were his words. But later, Trump himself was seen backtracking, a bit more cautious. "Ah, yes, about that case. I didn't give the order, but that drug. Each narco boat causes 25,000 deaths in the United States. Something delirious like that." But he denied responsibility, and afterward, everyone started blaming a commander, a third party, because now they're all afraid of a future judicial investigation. The truth is that here, once again, without leaving behind yesterday's topic of Venezuela and its context, we are witnessing a policy of hardening toward Latin America with this military deployment and with a message conveyed through these attacks. 22, 80 dead in general terms. Obviously, the issue of oil is present, and the United States specifically wants Venezuela's oil. We'll focus on that shortly. I'm starting the analysis with the broader picture, the regional strategy. And within that regional strategy, by the way, a clear enemy appears. An enemy, as they call it in English, a peer adversary, a rival on equal footing with the United States, an enemy looking the US straight in the eye.
Mirando cara a cara, ojo a ojo, a Estados Unidos. La propia China.
China itself. That's why this attack, once again, sends a message to Venezuela, to all of Latin America, but also to China. And why to China? Because China buys 80% of Venezuelan crude oil. It's the main destination for Venezuelan crude exports since the sanctions began. Second is India. 2 countries, 2 strategic rivals, 2 strategic enemies within BRICS. So this attack, by extension, also seeks to send a message to China. However, be careful with this, because this attack on China actually produces exactly the opposite effect.
Genera exactamente lo contrario. Y ahí presenciamos la estupidez de la.
And there we witness the stupidity of US foreign policy. The stupidity, the senselessness of the policy of a declining empire, even with respect to its own objectives, even considering that it seeks certain goals, such as Venezuelan oil, and the subordination of Latin America to the United States. Well, all these violent, military, economic, and political actions produce exactly the opposite effect. Today, China appears as the main buyer of oil because the United States created that situation. The United States
determinó esa situación. Estados Unidos. Alguien, si todavía pareciese vivo Kissinger.
If Kissinger was still alive, someone could, as he once did, remember that phrase of his about the war in Ukraine? Say, "We're handing Russia to the Chinese on a silver platter." Indeed, the war in Ukraine, promoted by the United States against Russia, created an even stronger alliance between Russia and China. Well, the same thing is happening here with Venezuela. We could paraphrase Kissinger, if he was still alive, by saying, they handed Venezuela over to the Chinese. Why? Because until 2014 or 2015, when the sanctions against Venezuela began, at least the strong ones, under Obama, who was the main buyer of Venezuelan oil? Even in Chavez's time. Yes, the country of stars and stripes, the United States.
Barritas, Estados Unidos. De toda la vida, pero incluso
all his life. But even during the first 15 years of Chavismo, with Chavez, despite his anti-imperialist discourse, critical of the United States, and rightly so, of course, Chavez never stopped selling oil to the United States, because it was an excellent business for Venezuela. And at one point, I remember that, trying to provoke Chavez, some servile journalist, some anti-Chavista journalist, teased him a bit. "Ah, you speak badly of the United States, but you still sell oil to the United States." And Chavez replied at that press conference, well, they're the ones buying our oil. They're the ones dependent on us, not the other way around. If the United States doesn't want our oil anymore, we'll sell it elsewhere. They're the ones showing up here as the dependents.
Ellos aparecen aquí en dependencia de nosotros y no viceversa. Así respondía Chávez.
From us, and not the other way around. That's how Chavez would respond, with that quick wit and immediate cleverness. Well, but beyond all that, Chavez, intelligent and pragmatic, did not stop selling oil to the United States until 2014, already after Chavez had passed away, if I remember correctly, when US sanctions against Venezuela began. And this led, on the one hand, to a sharp drop in production, naturally. At that time, Venezuela was producing between 2.5 and 3 million barrels per day. Today, it produces, after a reactivation of oil production in recent years, around 1 million barrels and rising. But it once dropped to 500,000 due to the severity of US sanctions at the time. Well, starting in 2014, the United States' share in the acquisition of Venezuelan oil began to decrease at an unprecedented rate, as did Venezuelan production, which produced for the United States an effect completely opposite to what was intended, because Venezuela then began to establish ties with China, with Iran, well, with North Korea, at least not in the oil sector, but it could have been as well, and with other countries interested in its oil in the face of US hostility and sanctions. It's the policy of a declining power, trying to obtain by force what it can't achieve diplomatically, when it should instead be building good ties with Venezuela because of its strategic interest. Moreover, during those years, the shift in the US oil production model through fracking also took place. Until then, the United States basically didn't produce enough oil to meet its enormous domestic consumption, so it relied on imports. Suddenly, fracking appeared on a massive scale, hydraulic fracturing, which allowed them to greatly increase oil production by extracting this oil from shale, as they call it, from within the rocks.
el esquisto, como llaman, dentro de las piedras, ¿sí? Y esa fantasía.
And that temporary fantasy still exists, but it's becoming less and less clear because the reserves of unconventional oil have already started to decline, including US fracking oil, even now. Well, suddenly that oil surplus, the fact that instead of importing oil, the United States itself could make foreign sales, created for a while the illusion that within the context of American strategic foolishness, with all these unpresentable figures, Obama, Bush Jr., Biden, well, Trump himself, then we no longer want Venezuelan oil.
Bueno, entonces ya no queremos petróleo venezolano. Bueno, ahora sí lo quieren de vuelta.
Well, now they do want him back, scared of China and of Venezuela's relationship with China. That's the context. And another thing, by the way, regarding the American foolishness in its relationship with Venezuela, within the framework of sanctions and policy toward Venezuela, they caused the bankruptcy of Citgo in the United States. Citgo is basically a Venezuelan state-owned company in that country. If you go through the streets of the United States, you'll see Citgo gas stations, just like Exxon or Texaco, but they're Citgo stations owned by the Venezuelan government.
Del Estado venezolano, y claro, toda esta situación generó la quiebra y hace poquito, ilegalmente.
And of course, this whole situation led to bankruptcy, and just recently, illegally and forcibly, the US authorities carried out an auction of Citgo. Until recently, for next to nothing, it was sold, badly sold, to a bidder, which supposedly, yes, of course, implies not only a violation of the law, but also an appropriation, a theft of Venezuelan assets in the United States. For Venezuela, bad. Supposedly for the United States, good, because of the illegal seizure of this asset. But this once again causes a breakdown in the oil relationship between the United States and Venezuela. And of course, following the seizure of Citgo, Venezuela has fewer and fewer incentives to export oil to the United States. Why?
¿Por qué? Porque ¿dónde realizaban la refinación?
Because where they carried out the refinement, of Venezuelan oil in the United States, Venezuelans did it, above all, in their own refineries at Citgo, now stolen by the Americans. So, with this policy of hostility toward Venezuela, they are precisely causing Venezuela to turn toward China, toward India, and toward the BRICS, with Citgo as well. This is the general context. There is the context of US policy for the region, for Venezuela, against China. And then, here the possible options for the United States appear, outside the pursuit of good relations, outside at least, of a stable diplomatic relationship, even with tensions like in Chavez's time. So what alternatives appear?
Y entonces, ¿qué alternativas aparecen? La invasión, pero ¿cuál es el problema para Estados Unidos?
The invasion.
Una invasión en Venezuela.
But what's the problem for the United States with this? An invasion of Venezuela would mean the beginning of a disaster for the United States. Why? Because Venezuela has organized stable armed forces and a society mobilized against a possible US invasion. It wouldn't respond like Iraq did, with disorganized armed forces, an internal civil war, and mobilization of the civilian population in the face of the US invasion. By the way, let's remember, beyond all this strategic analysis, the massacre, we might not be able to call it genocide, because in reality, the Americans, more than wanting the death of Iraqis, wanted the oil itself.
En sí, y técnicamente el genocidio responde a la búsqueda de la...
And technically, genocide is about seeking the elimination of an ethnic group, a religious group, a human group. They wanted Iraq's oil. However, as a consequence of that ambition, according to some figures, they caused 1 million deaths. According to others, a bit less, 500,000. A massacre. Well, I don't even want to remember Afghanistan. Now, in Venezuela, they would collide with something much tougher. They would crash against an even harder rock. But of course, since they can't, or couldn't, carry out an invasion, then what do they want? They want the deterioration of Venezuela through all these actions. The attacks on the drug boats, the seizure of that oil tanker, the sanctions, and so on, and so on, and so on.
Trump,
from the very beginning, from his first presidency, even before that, wanted the overthrow of Chavez's government at the time. and later of Maduro's. He doesn't like Venezuela, but Trump is known for his volatility and for a pragmatic, business-oriented view of things. So, he might not have started this action, nor the deployment of troops to the region and the attacks, already going on for more than a month, against boats accused of drug trafficking, without someone by his side whispering in his ear, presenting this situation as something feasible. The more attacks, the greater the attacks on Venezuela, the greater the chance of obtaining its oil, the greater the possibility, or rather, the greater the probability of Maduro's downfall. A stupidity, because they won't be able to bring about Maduro's downfall due to the internal cohesion of Venezuelan society, the Venezuelan state, and the Venezuelan government. But even though Trump would want this, if he deliberated in his own terms of benefits and quick gains, he shouldn't start a hostile action against Venezuela. But evidently, someone appears there at his side. Who? Marco Rubio. And I call him Narco for obvious reasons, right? Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Security Advisor, descendant of the ruling oligarchies in pre-revolution Cuba. Yes, they would once again want all of Latin America and Venezuela as slaves to their plantations, like Marco Rubio's grandparents.
Los abuelos de Marco Rubio, y ese odio ideológico de Marco Rubio está evidente.
And that ideological hatred from Marco Rubio is clearly taking a toll on Trump, even though this American venture represents a terrible deal for the United States and could turn out to be an even worse one. But what's the goal then? Deterioration. And what could bring this to a halt? End it, or at least de-escalate it? Well, precisely. Another voice in Donald Trump's other ear, showing, explaining, defining how bad this deal is for the United States. Not the voice of another advisor, because everyone around him holds similar ultra-hawkish positions, but the voice of his own electorate, his own political base.
De su propia base electoral. Entonces, con todo mi permiso.
So, with all due respect, this is a message for the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro. If I may call you Nicolás, I was with Chavez from the beginning, so I'll call you Nicolás, speaking to you informally, Nicolás Maduro. To a large extent, Venezuela's fate will depend on the domestic politics of the United States and on the stance taken by Donald Trump's electoral base. So Nicolás, President Maduro. Well, someone might respond, no, Venezuela's fate will depend on the will of the Venezuelan people and their steadfast defense of sovereignty. Yes, I don't reject any of that.
Férrea defensa de la soberanía, sí, no rechazo todo eso. El pueblo venezolano presenta una actitud.
The Venezuelan people are showing a heroic attitude in the face of US attacks. But I want to focus on the aggressor, okay? Because no war is better than a war that never starts. So Nicolás, your foreign policy toward the United States should focus on convincing Trump's voter base, because that voter base can create a counter voice against Marco Rubio's voice, whispering in his ear, let's go after Venezuela, because this will bring down Maduro and will seize the oil. No. You, Nicolás, must bring about a change in the position of Trump's voters, who reject wars, so that Trump reconsiders and backs down, as he did with Israel, when his own voters began to take a critical stance toward Israel.
Presentar una posición crítica frente a Israel, entonces determinó Trump el fin del apoyo.
So Trump decided to end the total and unconditional support, the blank check to Israel, and set a limit, no more attacks on Gaza. And Netanyahu had to respond. Was it because Trump is good? Because he cares about human lives? No, he wants business over there. But when his electoral base, through the increasingly critical voices of the media figures in the MAGA movement, when those figures, even Charlie Kirk, killed, and according to many voices within the MAGA movement, killed by Israel. Right, no, we can't determine that. Trump's voters picked up on that idea, and that created a voice in Trump's ear, attentive to his own voters, pushing for a change in his policy toward Gaza. Well, the same, Nicolás. You must generate a voice in the United States.
Bueno, lo mismo, Nicolás, debes generar voz en Estados Unidos. Entonces, estos videos,
So, these videos, these speeches, speaking a little in English, with that don't worry, peace, yes, war, no thing, all very nice, with humor. That helps, yes. But you should also create and establish a clear and serious message for Trump's voting audience, which, by the way, rejects wars. They won't want Venezuela, they won't want socialism, they won't want you, Nicolás, but they will reject any potential intervention in Venezuela because of the terrible outcomes for themselves. Increasing poverty, more marginalization, less employment, more inflation. So your team, dear Nicolás, should immediately call Candace Owens, for example, one of the media figures of the MAGA movement. Why not Tucker Carlson?
¿Por qué no a Tucker Carlson? Inmediatamente llámenlo a Tucker Carlson. Exclusiva para Tucker.
Call Tucker Carlson immediately. Exclusive for Tucker Carlson. Immediate interview with Maduro. Even better, invite Tucker Carlson to Venezuela. It would be a media event, like Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin. And once Tucker Carlson is in Venezuela, hold an interview in which Maduro, you, Nicolás, basically presents Venezuela's desire to maintain a good relationship with the United States and respect for Venezuela's sovereignty. And that if there is a good relationship, then Venezuela could resume selling oil to the United States. That will shape Trump's foreign policy much more than anything else. Even more than the high military cost of an invasion compared to the possible response of a mobilized Venezuelan society and its armed forces.
Venezolana movilizada y sus fuerzas armadas. También importantísimo, sin abandonar eso.
Also extremely important, without abandoning that, without neglecting that. But that's the offensive side, right? Well, advice, dear Nicolás. Free, as a gift, because I care deeply about Venezuela, and I also care about Commander Chavez. Just a footnote, what else do they want then, in this analysis? In this analysis of the reasons and meaning of this attack, well, they also want the capture of Venezuela and its oil through an alternative government led by the Venezuelan opposition. And there appears none other than the unpresentable Maria Corina Machado, precisely yesterday in Oslo, for the belated reception of her laughable Nobel Prize for War rather than for peace. And she and the group around her are presenting this idea, through Marco Rubio, by the way. Let's easily bring down Maduro's government, and once we're in power, Americans will be able to start big businesses with us. That's why there are open promises of major business opportunities for the United States, and that's also why Maria Corina Machado has openly called for a military intervention in Venezuela. Here is her response, by the way, given today to this question. It's the question of whether she wants or rejects a military intervention in Venezuela. Pay attention.
The coast of Venezuela.
Yesterday, the United States seized a ship off the coast of Venezuela.
US military intervention in Venezuela.
Would you welcome this lady's face? Sweetie, the personification of evil. Would you welcome a US military intervention in Venezuela? And you're going to answer the following.
Maria Corina en Oslo.
Maria Corina in Oslo, Norway.
Venezuela, the threat of an invasion in Venezuela, and I am.
Some people talk about a possible invasion of Venezuela, about a potential invasion of Venezuela. But Venezuela has already been invaded. We have Russian agents, we have Iranian agents.
We have terrorist groups such as Hezbollah.
We have terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas.
We have terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas in Venezuela, all of them operating freely in agreement with the regime. We have drug cartels, Colombian guerrillas, and just about everything else. And yes, the devil himself, right? The North Koreans, well, I don't remember that part, but the North Koreans should have joined this little group too. Unbelievable. According to her, these groups have taken over 60% of our population. 60% of, who knows, people's homes taken by Colombian guerrillas, drug trafficking groups, those kinds of statistics just thrown around carelessly. The villains of the world, the Russians, supposedly took 60% of the population. It's like a horror movie, but what nonsense this lady is saying. They're not only talking about drug trafficking, but even human trafficking, prostitution, and children.
So this has turned Venezuela into the criminal hub of the Americas. And
This has turned Venezuela into the center of criminal activity across the Americas.
repression system. Where does that funds?
And all of this is sustained by a system that finances repression.
And where do those funds come from?
Arms trafficking.
Well, about arms trafficking, drug trafficking, oil trafficking. Wow, what a story this lady made up.
¿Qué película inventada por esta señora?
Those flows. And once it happens, and repression is...
And when that repression ends and the regime falls, the whole problem disappears.
We ask the international community to cut those sources.
That's why we're asking the entire international community to cut off the sources of funding for the Venezuelan regime.
Because the other regimes that support...
Because everyone who supports Venezuela has turned the country into a haven for criminal operations.
La guarida de las operaciones criminales. Bueno, dentro de toda esta ensalada, mami.
Well, in the middle of all this mess, darling, in this mix of child trafficking, prostitution, drugs, the Colombian guerrilla, and everything else, she basically answers yes. She wants a US invasion of Venezuela. She would welcome a US military attack on Venezuela as long as Maduro's government falls. Why? Because she wants to take power herself, and then, of course, hand over all the resources to the United States. Above all, the oil, but not only that. The Nobel Peace Prize winner is telling us directly, ma'am, you would want a US invasion.
Usted, señora, querría una invasión de Estados Unidos. Bueno, que el tráfico de niños y de la...
Well, child trafficking, prostitution, North Korea, and the devil himself. But yes, a real disgrace. No longer just a traitor to the nation, but a plain warlord. And then there's Trump's other hope. That's why we showed the video of Trump, or above all, of Marco Rubio whispering in Trump's ear. The downfall, not because of an invasion, but because of Venezuela's deterioration. Its economy, its politics, its state, its government. The downfall brought on by an internal uprising. Still waiting for that internal uprising since '99, since Chavez came to power. The downfall, and the rise of this lady, and the surrender of everything. Here just a little more.
Hi, Maria Corina. I'm Pal Mosquera from CNN. Now that you've been in hiding for many, many months, do you think the government might have known where you were doing this?
Paul algo, no recuerdo ahora el nombre.
Paul Mosquera from CNN. Maria Corina, you were in hiding underground in Venezuela for many months. Do you think the government knew where you were?
Obvio.
I don't think...
Obviously.
No,
I don't think they knew.
And surely...
Y ciertamente,
they would have done everything to stop...
And certainly, if they had known, they would have done everything to stop me. Well, if the Venezuelan government had really wanted this lady's arrest, she not only wouldn't have been able to give interviews to everyone, online and even in person, she also wouldn't have been able to leave Venezuela on her way to Oslo for the reception of this Nobel Prize of War, and much less would she have been able to get the obvious cosmetic surgeries on her face, which looks more and more like the Joker, as you call him in your countries, with her mouth full of Botox, lifted cheekbones, and so on and so forth.
Los pómulos levantados, etcétera, etcétera. Así que una clandestinidad algo particular.
So, a rather peculiar kind of hiding, with plastic surgeons in this lady's case. Maduro's government decided to grant this lady her freedom, or at least decided not to imprison her. It's a political calculation. Well, that's debatable, whether it's good or bad, what the best policy is. But this business of selling the idea of her being in hiding and showing this lady in caves, when she reappears every day looking more operated on, better dressed, and more made up, and anywhere in the world. Well, folks, a little more coherence in the narrative, right? All right, demolishers, just two little things before we wrap up.
Mañana nosotros con una charla en...
Tomorrow we'll have a live talk with, in my opinion, one of the best-known experts on China, at least in the Spanish-speaking world, Adrián Díaz Marro. By the way, he has a very interesting YouTube channel, Ese Shanghai. We'll be having a conversation with him tomorrow. Don't miss it, it's sure to be great. And on Saturday, instead of Friday as usual, we'll have the talk with Juan Antonio Aguilar. On another note, I wanted to make a clarification that's a bit outside our usual geopolitical topics, but important, because in recent weeks, even in recent months, YouTube channels have been multiplying. Content on social media and YouTube has been multiplying, but especially the content created with artificial intelligence.
Creados con inteligencia artificial. Generan unos contenidos falsos.
They generate false, misleading content, but very cleverly tailored for each person. The content that best fits their worldview, their ideology, their way of seeing the world. So of course, since they present each person with specific content containing false and unreal information about what those people would want, based on that worldview, they end up showing growing popularity. One of those sites, and this thanks to our friend, Professor Joan Bach, and even a relative of mine as well. Yesterday, all of them were sharing news and information with me. Hey, check this out! Apparently this happened. You didn't mention it on your channel. Why aren't you covering it? Well, all that information is false. Here's an example of that. One of those channels, Cuentos de Poder. For example, Chile nationalizes lithium. False. China blocks the Panama Canal. False.
Mentira. China bloquea el canal de Panamá. Mentira. Rusia despliega misiles en Cuba. Mentira.
Russia deploys missiles in Cuba. False. But of course, since they present a mix of truths, half-truths and false information, many people, honestly and innocently, get hooked on these channels. And they all present, for example in this case even, pay attention to this, John Mearsheimer, but not the real one, rather one created by artificial intelligence. It's an AI animation. John Mearsheimer on one side, and at several points speaking as if he were supposedly a former official of the International Monetary Fund. Mearsheimer, one of the leading living theorists of international relations, is not a member of the International Monetary Fund. And they even start all speaking the same way. Pay attention to the speech. There is a fundamental principle in geopolitics that has existed since the
Well, in Rome, still in the times of ancient Rome,
Todavía en los tiempos de la Roma antigua, ningún principio.
no geopolitical principle of strategic weapons beyond 150 kilometers, all that kind of nonsense. Attention, remember the beginning, right? There is a principle, also made up. Now pay attention to this one. China blocks the Panama Canal.
there is an ancient principle in geopolitics that every strategist knows.
Bueno, el mismo comienzo, el mismo inicio,
Well, the same beginning, the same start. There is a fundamental principle. Well, all the same. Why am I presenting this here? Well, on one hand, as a warning, a call for caution to the debunkers, both men and women, against these channels made with artificial intelligence, both in animation and in the content itself, even if their content may seem appealing, because we would all indeed like to see a more active role from Russia in Cuba, or the Chinese more active in the Panama Canal, or the Iranians, well, all those things. But all lies, none of that is true, on one hand. And on the other hand, be careful, because this creates problems for serious analysts. Fortunately, here on the channel we have you, the debunkers, a super loyal audience. We haven't seen a drop in our views or in your engagement.
Una caída de nuestras visualizaciones o del acompañamiento, todo lo contrario, nosotros en crecimiento permanente, pero muchos otros canales...
Quite the opposite. We are in constant growth. But many other sister channels, yes. Even, well, our sister channel MP Geopolitics, which unfortunately will be wrapping up its existence, at least as a channel with its own analyst programs, now at the end of December. Well, those serious channels end up appearing as victims of these other junk contents, those made only for views and ad sales, and then all the efforts of so many serious analysts are undermined. That's why, from here as well, the message is, Beware of rotten fish. Beware of these things. Beware of YouTube suggestions. Never browse YouTube suggestions too much. Instead, based on your own knowledge, create a list of favorites, and when you want information or analysis, visit those channels.
Información, análisis, recorran esos canales. Aquí una cosa nueva.
Here's something new from Ezequiel Bistoletti, something new from Fernando Moragon, from Juan Antonio Aguilar, or from other critical channels. Colonel Pedro Baños, Santiago Armesilla, well, so many, well not that many, fewer and fewer. But things more or less in the style of Atilio Borón, naturally, in Argentina. That's how a kind of self-selection works. If you start following YouTube suggestions, more and more of this kind of junk will appear, increasingly appealing, undermining the work of serious analysts. That's why I wanted to mention, on that very same day, that several friends and relatives were sending these links to those videos. Pay attention to what happened here. What is this? Ezequiel, how can you not talk about that? Well, all lies. So be careful, careful with these things. Demolishers, both men and women. Yes, 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 unfortunately yes. It's been a year of attempts, and for now, unfortunately DMP is funded by this channel's revenue. Maybe in the future we can bring DMP back, a channel with top-notch analysts, spectacular analyses. Maybe we can bring it back with a different model. Not the mass reach and YouTube advertising one, but through Patreon, paid subscriptions, maybe. But for now, in January, we're going to start focusing here and on the English channel for the time being. And Fernando and Juan Antonio will host their own shows within Demolishing Political Myths. The rest of the MP analysts will obviously be invited back regularly as guests on the channels or elsewhere, already taken into account, right?
Ya descontado, ¿sí? Bien, demoledores y demoledores.
All right, demolishers, thank you very much to Nazareno for the super sticker and to Manuel Gomez for the subscription. Let's wrap up here. Remember, tomorrow we have the talk with Adrian Diaz-Maro, on Saturday the talk with Antonio Aguilar, and on Sundays, as always, the Sunday talks with our friend Fernando Moragon. Demolishers, we love you a whole lot so much. A kiss, a hug, and see you tomorrow. And in just a bit, in half an hour, Adrian Zelaya with his show on DMP Geopolitics. Bye-bye.
Adrián Zelaya con su programa por DMP Geopolítica. Chau, chau.